Good morning. It's such an honor to be here with all of you today. And I'm sure you're all proud of what San Diego County is doing. It's a great, great thing. And the entire country could look to you as an example. There are 5.5 million military and veteran caregivers in this country, and I am one of the 1.1 million post 9/11. My husband John was deployed to Fallujah, Iraq in 2004 with 1st Tank Battalion out of 29 Palms. My husband's deployment was uneventful. And by uneventful, I mean he returned home with all of his limbs. The multiple blasts that he was exposed to and the constant incoming fire and countless convoys while the first Battle of Fallujah was going down was all what the Marines had trained him for. So for the sheer luck that he didn't catch shrapnel or lose a body part meant that he was whole. We continue to believe that for many years, even though he was diagnosed with PTSD very quickly after returning to the States. PTSD isn't an injury. At least this was the belief up until a few years ago, as PTSD began really making a presence on major media outlets and key organizations began to advocate and shined a light on this stigma-ridden issue that hundreds of thousands of our service members and veterans are facing. Before researchers found that PTSD does create changes in one's brain, and before the word TBI meant anything. John served his 4 years and was honorably discharged from the Marine Corps in 2006. He continued to be the sole provider as I stayed home and cared for our 3 children. The months and the years following his discharge became darker, more depressed, more rageful, and more isolating than I could have ever imagined. I found myself living a life where I was trying to balance his PTSD and a healthy life for my family. Regretfully, the PTSD was winning. For the 3 years following John's discharge, we continued to live with the words and sentiment that the Marine Corps left us with. You're fine, nothing's wrong. Even though we were dealing with frequent suicidal ideations and living in the depths of PTSD. On July 19th, 2009, my husband, while sitting on our couch, hadn't shaved and hardly showered in the last month. He had confided in me that over the past 4 weeks, he was planning to kill his boss. He was having a complete mental breakdown. He just continued to say, I'm spinning. He lost about 20 pounds leading up to this time. His eyes were empty, and his face was the face of absolute despair. I knew that at that very moment, I needed to help my husband. And I, at that moment, had the weight of the world on my shoulders. I couldn't allow him to go to work the next day, and I needed to get my husband help immediately. As I stood in my bedroom, through my tears and through my shaking, I called the VA crisis line. I cried to the woman on the other end of the phone and spoke to her in a soft whisper so that my husband couldn't hear me from the other room. I explained to her what my husband had just told me, and I drove my husband to the VA emergency room where they awaited our arrival and ushered us to the back. He was hospitalized for several days, and what we learned after that hospitalization gave us a small glimpse into what we would learn in the near future. At this time, we really believed that he'd be back to work in a week or 2. But instead, within the couple weeks following, John was diagnosed with something neither one of us had ever heard of, TBI. Traumatic brain injury, well, it sounded really traumatic. And we didn't understand how this could be because he wasn't injured. Not long after, we learned that John had been living with a neurological visual impairment, a repercussion of the TBI. I read anything and everything I could about diagnosis, statistics, and commonalities between injuries. I educated myself on anything I could get my hands on. I searched for resources, and I was pushed to a place to find a strength within myself I didn't know existed. And I have to say I was on fire. I was getting stuff done, and I was handling it well. I became so passionate about the cause, and I began to rid our family of what I called the dirty secrets. I felt the best way to do this was to speak openly and candidly about our experiences. I shared with strangers in the line at the grocery stores or the bank about PTSD and TBI, and I was so amazed how many people were not aware of what our returning service members were facing. In 2011, the application process opened up for the VA caregiver program. I wasn't even going to apply because I didn't think I was a caregiver, but I did anyway. We were one of the first 93 families approved in the program nationwide. Then, I realized for the first time that I was my husband's caregiver. I began hearing people say, "Be careful, you don't want to burn yourself out." I wasn't quite sure what they meant by that. I felt good, I was taking care of my husband and my children, and I felt like I was doing a great job. I was conscious of possible resentment creeping in. I was aware of doing things that made me happy. I thought I had it under control. And one day, I blinked. And where I found myself was in a deep, dark, lonely depression and ridden by anxiety. I had anger boiling in my belly, and I found myself drowning. I thought I was taking care of myself, and I thought I was listening to my own needs, but it crept in on me. I felt weak, and I felt like I failed. Slowly, I began reflecting on the last 7 years. I realized that my husband's triggers became mine. I was looking for those triggers before they would find him. And in doing so, I may have saved him from being triggered, yet it left me feeling agitated and irritated and triggered. About a year ago, I was in the midst of the hardest fight for the appropriate care for my husband yet. He had been experiencing episodes or spells for the last 18 months. These spells were diagnosed as panic attacks with disassociation, but I knew that's not what it was. I logged and I documented everything. No one would listen until he had his first grand mal seizure. A few days later, someone mentioned Operation Family Caregiver. I'd been doing this caregiving thing for 9 years now. Majority of those years, I didn't know I was a caregiver. It was time. I had done it far too long alone. I made the call to the Southern Caregiver Resource Center here in San Diego, where the Operation Family Caregiver is based out of. I scheduled my first meeting with my caregiver coach, and I wasn't quite sure what to expect. We decided on meeting at a local Starbucks, and there, I was greeted by someone who would eventually give me the tools to get my life back. During this time, my husband was diagnosed with epilepsy due to his TBI. My caregiver coach even met me at UCSD, where my husband was being evaluated for a week at the epilepsy center. Week by week, I felt stronger, a little more capable than the week before. My coach would work with me on evaluating my largest stressors and taught me how to approach these issues I was facing in a way that I could manage them. Not only did we work on self-care techniques, but she held me accountable, which is so important because caregivers, we put everyone else first. Eventually, all that I was learning became habit. It became the new way of life. Today, I am a fellow for the state of California with the Elizabeth Dole Foundation. My responsibility as a fellow is to advise the foundation on military and veteran caregiver needs and concerns, speaking directly with lawmakers to encourage them to support military and veteran caregiver legislation, and to bring awareness to those who are caring for our nation's wounded, ill, and injured service members and veterans. Senator Elizabeth Dole commissioned the RAND Corporation to conduct a thorough study to inform understanding of military caregivers and efforts to better support them, the first of its kind. 41% of military and veteran caregivers are between the ages of 18 and 30 years old. 33% are spouses, and 25% are parents. As noted in the RAND study, the Rosalind Carter Institute's Operation Family Caregiver is an evidence-based program designed to improve caregivers' problem-solving capabilities and improve overall quality of life. 40% of post-9/11 caregivers are experiencing depression, and nearly 45% are experiencing anxiety. Programs like OFC are not just important to the veteran caregiver community, but they are needed as a preventative program so that caregivers have the opportunity to learn the needed techniques in order to manage the lives ahead of them. With TBI being the signature injury of the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, with 333,169 diagnosed by the Department of Defense alone, and 400,000 diagnosed with PTSD. And these numbers do not include those diagnosed through the VA. This is a generation affected, not only a generation of service members and veterans, but their families, their spouses, and their children. I feel that it's our responsibility as a community, as a state, and as a country to support them and their families who have been forever affected by war. I overheard my husband say so eloquently the other day, I fought the first half of the war, and now my wife is fighting the second half. Thank you.